Here's the intake manifold. There are a bunch of screws around the side here that hold the top and bottom half together. It's just silicon together, so you have to just crack that apart, and then when you open it up, you can see the two halves. What you'll find inside is the flapper valve that actually changes the geometry of the intake. When vacuum is applied to it, which is at low RPM, it's actually going to sit up in this position here, which is against the spring loading, so the bellows activates and actually pushes it up to this position. And what that does, it actually covers up this section here, which then increases the runners. It actually does a couple of full laps of the entire manifold as it goes from one chamber to the other to actually increase the runner distance. At higher RPM, the bellows is deactivated, and that allows that to flop, and then it actually allows the air to go straight in here, which then allows it to go straight into the intake. So here's everything loosely assembled. You can see I've got the little actuator here connected to the arm that goes through here, and this is the spot in here that actually gets bound up and actually stops this from moving. So the way this works is it would sit like that normally. The bellows sits here, and then when the bellows activates, it just pulls that lever up. There's a big spring in here that actually it's pulling against. So when the bellows is deactivated, it then just flops down like that. When you are removing this, the reason it's difficult to get out and clean everything up, there's actually a big O-ring around here which seals to the inside of the manifold itself, and that actually is really quite snug. In addition to that, if this is all bound up in here, which is most likely is why you're probably pulling it out, then it's going to be a bit difficult. What you don't want to do is firstly be rough with it, because this is actually going to be hard up against these stops here with the screws in. Best thing I found to do is actually get a flathead screwdriver when we're getting out and sort of jam it in here and just wiggle it back and forth until you can gradually get a little bit of a gap in here, and then you can gradually work that out one side at a time. When you're doing that, you can see if that's like that and I just pull that out, it's actually going to let that drop out of the other side. Now with that off, you would actually be able to eventually find that and just shove it in the hole, because obviously you wouldn't be able to see that. But to stop that from happening, the easiest way to do this, as you pull things out, just push that back in. So you pull it out a little bit, push it back in again so it stays snug in the hole of the back here, and eventually that will just come loose like that, and that will stay in place, and then you can clean all this up. And what you want to do there is obviously clean up this shaft here, make sure there's all the gunk there, clean up the inside of there, maybe put a little bit of grease there so everything flows nicely, and then put everything back together again. With the spring, what you want to do is when you're installing it, you put it like that and then just rotate it around to the correct position, then and install it against the key. When you're actually pulling it off, there's a screw in here. You're going to remove that and then just gradually wiggle this out, and it'll be under a fair bit of spring tension. And then when it pops out, just allow it to rotate around like that, and then you can easily remove it. This has got the flapper valve and the actuator arm installed. When I put this in, that O-ring is actually quite tight, so make sure that when you put these in, do it a little bit at a time to gradually move it in there. Then I fitted the arm pointing up about here, fitted the spring, and then wrapped it around and just guided it into the key, and then just obviously tighten the small screw to hold everything together. And now you can see that works nice and smoothly, and hopefully that should work perfectly when it jumps into the car. This is obviously the front of the intake manifold. To remove the intake manifold, there's a bunch of screws around the outside, so the gasket's underneath here between there and the head. Don't remove the inner screws, because they actually connect the top to the bottom half of the manifold, which obviously we don't want to separate. At the front here we've got the bellows valve here, which is connected by this arm to the lever. When vacuum is applied, it sucks this that way and then allows that to go up. You can actually hear the air escaping when I do that from the valve which controls it, and when it's relaxed it just automatically flops back. The vacuum on this side, there's a single vacuum connection here which goes to a small pressure regulator, and then down through a pipe here there's a T-piece here which connects to this pipe, and that actually runs along the length of the intake manifold underneath and actually pops up the other side here. As you continue down, there's a second T connection which goes to this little valve. That actually goes to a small line which then runs along this edge and goes to the two secondary air valves at the back of the engine. And then finally you've got the connection here which allows vacuum to be applied to the bellows, which there are electrical connections here. And these connectors are where the plugs for the knock sensors are. There's actually two on each side, so make sure you obviously disconnect those, but also pull those out, because when you lift this up they will still be trying to be connected to it, so make sure you remove those. So all these plugs and everything are disconnected, all the lines are disconnected, so you can pull the thing up and out. At the rear of the intake manifold, obviously you can see where the air goes in from the throttle valve. If I activate the variable geometry plate, hopefully you can see inside that, that's actually going up and down, and you can actually put your hand inside there and actually feel that. So for example, if you were trying to free up the front of the valve, sorry, of the flapper plate, and it pops out of its little thing here, you can actually put your hand in here and actually guide it into the hole which is just inside there, so you're disconnecting or pulling the top half off to put everything back together again. For the lines you've got connected here, the big one at the back here is for the crankcase ventilation valve, which is the circular one that sits at the back here. That connects to one that actually goes down to the valley pan, and also there's two sides that actually go to each valve cover. In addition, you've got this line here which runs over to, if you're looking at the front from the left hand side of the engine, which is the fuel tank ventilation. So there's a valve up here which allows then the vapours to actually travel into the intake manifold. You've got this little baby line here which will just go straight to the fuel pressure regulator valve, which is up here, which sits on top of the fuel manifold. And the last one, this is the main vacuum line for the brakes. That'll actually go up and into the bulkhead near the battery. And then there's a T-piece, that line actually goes over to the backup. There's a little electric motor there which actually creates a vacuum if required. So that's over on the, if you're looking from the front, at the right hand side of the engine bay. The one that actually ran along the back here from the front and underneath actually sticks out the back here, and that's the one that goes to, from memory, there's a little container in the left front wheel well, which is a vacuum reservoir. It actually goes to that. This is the crankcase ventilation valve. To pull these apart, pretty simple. Get a screwdriver through the gap here and lift up, and then whilst you're doing that, get another screwdriver and just pry it. There are 6 of these clips all the way around, and they will just gradually ease open and you'll be able to pull the whole thing apart. When you pull it apart, what you'll find, there are 2 sides to it. There's a spring in the middle and the bellows. You can see this side is pretty clean. That's the side that's open to atmosphere. There's a small orifice there that opens to the other side. And on this side here, basically this is the inlet that's actually going to go to the intake manifold, and this comes from the valley pan and also from the valve covers. And all it is just a little pressure regulating valve. When you pull it apart, this will all be full of gunk, most likely, like this one was. That's actually been pretty cleaned up. The big thing that you want to check is this bellows here isn't broken, and in this case this one here was. And what I found when I cracked open the intake manifold, there was a lot of oil inside, and I suspect that is because this wasn't regulating properly. There's a lot of vacuum being pulled through into the intake manifold and sucking a lot of oil in rather than controlling that. To put it back together again, pretty simple. Just plonk that in there, spring on the top, this sits over the top, and you just press the thing together. Installation of the intake manifold. We've got the gaskets here which have all been cleaned up, if not new ones, if you want to install new ones. The plastic guide pins are here. You can see that's obviously a new one, that's an old one. That got snapped on the wax. I just wasn't careful enough, so when you remove the intake manifold, make sure it comes straight up, make sure all the vacuum lines are disconnected, so you can just pull it straight up and out so they don't get snapped off. If they do get snapped, these things are pretty cheap, and the stem of it, which will remain inside the head, is easy to just get a drill bit and you just push it out. It actually just comes straight out the bottom, so it's pretty easy to get rid of if you do snap them. The intake manifold itself getting ready to install. Obviously this tape will come off and those surfaces get nice and clean before they get put on there. All of the vacuum hoses are disconnected at the moment except for this one that actually goes underneath. Make sure when they actually come out of the factory this is taped on here, that it all come off. So I've just used a little bit of butyl tape to stick that to that spot there on the manifold itself, so when you install it, it doesn't dangle down and get in the way, which it will do if you don't stick that nicely to it. On the top of the engine, with the intake manifold removed, you can see obviously the 8 inlet ports. On top here is the valley pan oil sort of distributor unit. The oil filter housing actually connects to here. One's an inlet, one's an outlet to the oil filter housing. There's also a third one here which goes back onto this rear plate, which actually just allows the oil to travel back to the sump when you're changing the oil, so it can just drain to the bottom of the engine. When you're removing the bolts from the valley pan here, there are 7 larger screws around the perimeter and a whole bunch of these, I think there's about a dozen or so of these small countersunk screws. I didn't have any problems with these, but these, a number of the actual Torx fittings, the star thing actually stripped, making them impossible to get out because they're actually pretty poor quality mild steel, so I actually went and replaced those with some high tensile bolts, and they actually have an in-hex fitting vice a Torx fitting. Also, because these are countersunk, they actually have quite a large amount of surface area underneath, so they really grip the pan a lot, which makes them really difficult to get out. So what I've done is I've actually just put a tiny little bit of anti-seize paste on the underside of each of those prior to actually putting them in, just so they don't seize up. And this is the valley pan itself with the bolts removed. The pipe here goes up to the CCV up here, which goes into the intake manifold. There are 2 outlet and inlets here. That's for the oil filter housing, which sits up above. When you open this up, you can expect that one of these, I think it's this one here, will be full of oil because the check valves won't ever allow things to release. So when you actually lift this off, you can expect a whole bunch of oil to flow out the front here. So make sure you have a whole bunch of shop rags or something to clean everything up, because there's going to be a lot of oil go everywhere. Underneath the valley pan is the valley pan gasket, which is metal, and it's just a big thing that looks like that. Underneath the valley pan here, we've got two check valves, one that sits here and one that would actually go in that position there, just a valve spring loaded, which allows oil to come up out of these and to hold in there when the engine's actually turned off. In addition to that, there's a spray valve here. On top of that, there's also just two vent tubes that go down to the, I'm assuming, to the bottom of the block, and some oil drain holes as well at the bottom there. You can expect that this is obviously all going to be full of oil when you open the thing up. Here's the bottom of the engine with the oil pan removed. That's the oil pan there. A couple of small baffles in it, but outside of that, it's just a standard pan. This is obviously where the oil temperature and level sensor was, which I removed before actually removing the pan. When you remove it, just a bunch of bolts all the way around the edges. And when you remove all the bolts, it's still pretty stuck on there, so all I used was just a small pry tool, which I've just chopped in half, and I actually used a rubber mallet. I actually needed a good whack all the way around the entire perimeter to actually have the thing come loose. If you're doing this when it's like this, just leave a couple of bolts in up the top here, which is loosely in there, so it just sits there once it actually comes loose, so it doesn't just fall off. Or if it's under the car, obviously leave a couple of bolts, maybe in all four corners, just down maybe half a centimetre or so, so when it comes loose it sits there and then you can remove it easily. What you find underneath it, this is obviously the upper oil pan, and then on top of that is the actual block. This is the oil strainer, the oil pump. You see the drive from the accessory drive at the back of the engine drives through. I'm not sure if you can see, but as I turn that, is the little hexagonal shaft, like a big long Allen key, that actually drives into the oil pump. And in addition, it's probably a bit hard to see, but there's actually another set of gears that actually drives another shaft here that goes through to the water pump at the front as well. Additionally, you've got the output from the pump, goes straight up here to the oil cooler which is on the other side here, then back out of the oil cooler, and then straight up to the top of the engine and that front check valve in the valley pan. Once the oil pan is off, there are two oil pipes, one that'll sit here and one that sits like that. This one on this side has a O-ring on each side, so it'll just fit snugly into the hole. This one has a big seal. You can see this one here, and there's a circular one behind the pump here that sits flush against that plate there. Just a few screws and they just pull straight out. To remove the upper oil pan, which is this one here, there's a whole bunch of M8 triple square bolts all the way around the perimeter around here. There's a couple at the front here as well, and once you remove all of those, it's actually sealed to the block underneath it. You'll have to pry it clear because it'll be sitting on a few dowels underneath there, which are obviously going to hold it in place. This is the underside of the crankcase. Once that upper oil pan has been removed, there are three dowels here. You need to be careful of those as you're actually lifting it off, because it's quite a tight fit with the hole around the oil pump to manoeuvre it so it can come free, so you don't damage the underside of the upper oil pan. You can see a little bit more clearly here how the oil pump works. We've got at the back, got that sprocket which drives that hex shaft all the way through to the oil pump in here, and there's another sprocket down in here which is the one that actually drives through to the coolant pump. If you need to remove the oil pump, there are only a few bolts that you need to remove. The first thing is there are three, that one, and that one, and then this whole thing will actually pop straight off, because that's actually the sieve that feeds into the oil pump inlet, which is actually just behind my finger there. When that comes off, there are three bolts that need to come off. There's one there, and there's actually one underneath the sieve, which is why it actually needs to come off. And then once you've done that, you can pull it off. However, before you do that, you need to remove this shaft, and the way it talks about in the book, so it's actually, there's a spring in here that pushes it forward. It just pulls back, and it says to actually lock it with something so it doesn't actually move, and then you can pull the oil pump out. When you put it back in, obviously make sure that that actually engages properly and it's not actually still free up at this end. To get the seals out of the valve cover, obviously a big one around the edge, it's just going to pull that straight out. There is one in here that'll just pull straight off. The one that's on the baffle is two on one side and one on the other. It sits in there like that. The way that's designed is it actually has a lip, so it actually holds in there so it can't come out, and this will actually be quite hard, so it's actually, I found that you just could not pull that out without actually bending this, because it's actually quite flimsy. So the best way I found was to just get a knife that would be sitting there like that somewhat, and just cut around the edge. So cut it in half, and then you can just push that out the other side. Obviously you'll need to unscrew the screws on that baffle to take it off. They just pop straight off, clean out underneath it. When you put those on, I'm going to Loctite those so there's no way they can come off. To get out the plug seals, these are a bit of a pain because they're kind of like a crankshaft seal or something like that, and they're actually metal around the edge here, which gives it all its strength. And there's a spring on the inside. Actually, there's one here that has been damaged as I was pulling everything out here, which actually puts the pressure around the lip so everything stays nice and sealed. They're actually a little bit of a pain to get out. This is the way that I found was the best way to do it. I'm going to use a chisel. This one's a 10mm chisel, but something that's appropriate. You can see there's these little lips here. That's where I'm actually going to go in. I'm going to try and, I'm just going to whack it in there just a little bit to try and lift the seal and then lever it up. And then what I'm going to do is I've just got a screwdriver bit, which is just with a 1/4" drive. And then what I'm going to do is stick that in there and just lever it around and go around. I tried going in from the other side and trying to whack it out, and it just didn't work. It just wouldn't do it because around here is all rubber. The metal is all around the edge here, which you just can't get enough grip on it to actually give it a good whack out. So let's see if I can do this. So let's leave it up a little bit now. So I just stick that in there like that. And I can just go around the edge. And lift that out. With the valve covers, all the screws that go around the outside, they'll just be sitting in there like that. You can just push each of those out. They sometimes just need a little bit of a whack with a screwdriver or something, but they'll all just pop out, and then you can clean all of those up because they've got rubber grommets on them. And all the paint and stuff that peels off these valve covers, it'll be stuck to it, etc., which isn't going to seal very well. So I would suggest that you do that. There are a whole bunch of small ones, and there are a couple of long ones, one at each end, and the one for the centre is actually long. Again, they just pull straight out. With the baffle that has come out of it, it's actually sealed to the inside with a typical silicon sealant that you see around the engine. So you'll find on the inside here there'll just be a whole bunch left, as well as just around the edges of where it sits. Make sure you just get, well, I just use a plastic tool, and that just pulls that off straight away pretty easily, and then we're just going to replace that with that silicon sealant prior to installation.